Hello and welcome to a beautiful day in North Carolina. We are I think it's one of the last 70-degree days of the year, but the leaves are beautiful and falling, and just want to welcome you to a new episode of the Pilates Hour. So while you're coming on, it's just me today. We're going to be talking about rotational sports and athletes and rotational activities. We have a full jam-packed hour of information, knowledge, exercises, things to look at. Hopefully it'll be very educational. So as we look at this rotational sports, I always like to come back to the basics of our movement principles, and breath, as important as breath is, and we'll talk about a little bit. I think we're going to spend most of our time today talking about mobility, control, alignment, and coordination. And when we think of the benefits of Pilates for rotational sports and activities, we can think of things like the distribution of force through joints, efficiency of movement, injury prevention by distribution of movement, and also maximizing the force. Momentum is where our force comes from. A lot of people think that it's from the power itself, and you'll see big muscular guys trying to swing a golf club, and they don't hit the ball nearly as far as somebody that really understands the technique and the efficiency of rotation in the human body. So if we take a look at the top of the skeleton here, and we think of the talus through the navicular, through the cuneiform, and down into the first three rays, is going to be responsible for pronation. That's going to be the flattening of the foot. If we look over here on this side, this is that arch that would spin down towards the floor. For example, in mid stance, when we're standing up on our feet, that's where that splay comes from of the feet, is that particular part of the foot rotating there. On the other side of the foot, we have the calcaneus, and the calcaneus through the cuboid into the lateral two digits. But if we look at this video clip, and it's going to repeat itself a couple times, this medial side is bigger than the lateral side. So that facilitates a rotation that happens over and over and over again. So on this one, we now are looking at the hip joint, and that's the relation between the femur and the pelvis. And I love this video series here. Basically looking at the relationship of how the pelvis or the femur moves on the pelvis. But what you have to remember is if the femur is in a closed chain where the foot's on the ground, it's the pelvis that moves around the femoral head. So a lot of the rotational sports, the turning, the shifting of the center of gravity, is really coming from this mobility that exists around the pelvis. And if we look at all the directions, abduction, adduction, internal, external rotation, you can see how probably one of the primary sources of rotational sport forces is coming from the pelvis on top of the femur. And when we come up into the pelvis, and this is where old anatomy, we would look at this and we would say, these are like ligaments that just don't move or don't ever have mobility or laxity unless you're having a baby. But nowadays, we know that's not true. And we also know that the bone has a fair amount of mobility in as well. So we go a little bit deeper and we come on up and think of how the lumbar spine is going to stack on top of the sacrum, and the lumbar spine properties, the ligaments that are around it, even some of the muscles and the deep muscles around there. You see here the piriformis. If we look at the connective tissues and some of the inert tissues, we often don't use the word inert anymore when we think of biotensegrity. These are continuous tissues. But in this depiction of it, you'll notice the different angles that are, or the lines that are in the annulus of the disc, and the rings that are there horizontally around the nucleus pulposus of the disc. So all of these tissues, again, I love this depiction, but I'm afraid that those of us that are very sedentary, that our annulus does not look like this. Our annulus looks very sagittal and very weighted posteriorly because of the amount of flexion in sitting that we have, the average 13 hours per day for humans in the Western world today there. When we go into the inert structures of the lumbar spine, additional ones that I like to bring attention to are the ligamentum flavum, the posterior longitudinal and the anterior longitudinal ligaments. And then there's also a lot of interspinous processes, ligamentous structures or connections. Now, all of these have a varying degree of elasticity and collagen and plasticity. So here we look at the infrastructure of the shoulder girdle, we look at the clavicle, we look at the scapula. Now, if we're doing rotational sports with upper extremity, so anything with clubs, paddles, hockey sticks, bats, all of those things, they're all going to have a relationship coming up here through the glenohumeral joint, coming into the clavicle and coming into the scapula. Now, a rule of shoulder, it's not a rule of thumb because thumbs don't have anything to do with it, but I think in the shoulder, if I lay my fingers on top of the clavicle and on top of the spine of the scapula, they should be pointing directly to the head of the humerus. So we know sometimes people have their head of the humerus is really anterior to the scapula. So they're literally subluxed anteriorly. So here we look at a picture of Tiger Woods swinging a club, and here you get the idea of the foot pronation, supination down here, the tibial rotation, the femur rotation opposite direction, pelvis in opposite direction, lumbar in the opposite direction, thoracic in the other direction, and even the head the opposite direction. So just like the lid spinning on the jar, I happen to have a jar right here, but if I was spinning the lid, it's always going to be in the opposite direction. That's the distribution of movement that needs to be there. We can almost always identify if they come and they say, oh, my knee's hurting or my elbow's hurting or my foot is hurting, that they do not have enough mobility in their hips and in their thoracic spine. And that's a very lazy way of doing it. But if you didn't have the resources to do better, that's what you could do, is look at restoring ankle dorsiflexion, hip rotation mobility, and thoracic mobility. And here's just another example of just, a beautiful example of how fascia connects to all the organs, nervous system, tissues of the body, bones of the body to help us move. We can take a look at it a little more carefully with a specific activity of something like a soccer kick and realizing how that has effect of tension, for example, tension on the backside, elasticity on the front side, that are creating these powers to be able to move us through space as efficiently as possible. Speed. We go down a little bit deeper. We start looking at the connection of how the pelvis, the quadratus lumborum, the psoas major, even the multifidi, and how they interact with that rotational sport. So these are areas that also need to be conditioned with rotation and recoiling load that we can do very easily in our Pilates environment. Here's a couple examples. Spine twist, the twist, corkscrew as we get a little more advanced, long box, seated twist, stomach massage with twist, trapeze table twist and pull, punching at the end of the trapeze table, sidearm twist. These become more and more advanced, but the idea is that the load of gravity and the direction orientation of the body create the proper demand for the tension and the compression of these tissues. And that brings us to the very end, and just 4 minutes over. I apologize for going long today. I really try hard to stay inside of our hour. I know you're all busy. Remember to be kind, and we'll see you next week with another really exciting case study next week on autoimmune disease. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to learn more about Pilates Hour, subscribe in the link below.